BookTube and Bookstagram. On these platforms, there are not a lot of non-fiction books. It's predominantly fiction. And when there are non-fiction books, it is almost guaranteed to be a self-help book.
Game review.
So I have some thoughts and opinions on self-help books. Let's talk about them. So I want to talk about the pros first. The first pro is that self-help books tend to be really accessible. So if you're someone who's just getting into self-development, or even just beginning to read, self-help books can be really useful given that they're accessible. They don't really cite multivariate statistics. Very seldom will you find a self-help book with a bunch of math in it. That doesn't happen. They're not jargony. The paragraphs are usually concise. You got 1 or 2 points in the paragraph. Comparatively speaking, when you read a philosophy book, you might have like 5 premises in a single paragraph that you then have to connect to another one. So it's not as complex. Self-help books are just super accessible, and so that's a good pro. Point number 2, or pro number 2, is if you're someone who actually is just getting into self-development, or just beginning to read, for that matter, self-help books can set you on the right track. Because there's so many specific niches in self-help, you can really get on the right track with what you want to start with. Take How to Win Friends and Influence People, Atomic Habits, or even the marshmallow test. Let's say you want to learn about how to control your impulses. You find you're a really impulsive person and you want to control that. A book like the marshmallow test will actually teach you about the science behind impulse control, the neuroscience behind impulse control as well. It will also tell you the scientifically backed methods used in the studies to actually increase impulse control and how to apply it to your daily life. So you have like a really strong, scientifically informed framework to start developing your impulse control abilities. And it'll even answer some of the questions and curiosities you have about impulse control. So if you want to focus on something new in your life and develop in some way, self-help books are really good for that reason. Another wonderful thing about self-help books is they can be there when other people aren't. When there's just not someone there to give you advice, or the people who usually give you advice are absent, the book will always be on the shelf and it'll be waiting for you to pick it up as opposed to, say, waiting on someone else to come and give you advice. And that's great about self-help books. If you think about Father Emerson's essay on self-reliance, people have been reading that thing for years, probably close to hundreds of years now. And that essay will always be there to teach you about self-reliance. If you need lessons about life is difficult, the Stoics have been telling people that life is extremely difficult for a very long time now. There's just tons and tons of self-help books that can give you advice on things when you need it. Another pro for these books is that they give you a competitive advantage. As much as I would say don't read self-help books to get competitive advantages, because I think that comes from a bit of a disingenuous place sometimes, it is nonetheless a fact that self-help books can give you tools that can give you advantages over people. A good example comes from the book How to Win Friends and Influence People. Dale Carnegie was advising someone who was basically a manager for a workplace. And this manager had to basically get people to not only smoke off premises, but also wear their hard hats when they were doing construction. And rather than reprimanding them, or threatening them, or punishing them, maybe taking some of the money from their pay or something, I don't know, however he wanted to do it, Carnegie advised him to buy them a box of cigars, and as you buy them this box of cigars, correct their behavior at the same time. And so the person bought the cigars, brought it to them, corrected their behavior as he was giving them the cigars, said, hey, can you guys smoke off premises and please wear your hard hats, something to this effect. Obviously the wording is important here. And it worked, right? So that's one way where you have some situation that you have to solve. And if it's between you and another manager who have to solve that situation, well, you're going to have a competitive advantage because you read the advice given by Dale Carnegie. So self-help books can give you tools that are advantages in life. The last pro I'm going to list here is that reading self-help books just helps you generally focus on healthier things, better mindsets, better habits, staying focused on the idea of self-developing, right? Think about how long it takes you to actually read a self-help book. You're talking maybe 15, 25 hours. You're basically meditating on the nature of self-improvement for 15 or 25 hours as you're reading. So that's another pro of self-help books, is it really helps you reinforce these positive virtues in life. Now let's talk about some of the cons with self-help books, and there are no shortage of cons for self-help books. One is that they repeat themselves quite frequently. And when I say repeat themselves, I don't mean like inside the one book that you're reading. What I mean is book A and book B will probably overlap in like 80% of the material. A lot of self-help books repeat one another. In fact, I guarantee you, if you walked into a bookstore and picked up 15 self-help books, they'll probably actually be very similar and probably deal with a lot of the same topics. So that's one drawback to self-help books. Another drawback is some of the advice given in the self-help books isn't compatible with human nature.
If I can't have my shoes, Karen can't have her mom.
Sometimes books will say things like, don't compare yourself to others. And as much as I agree with this in theory, and as much as I try and practice it in my own daily life, social psychology research tells us that not only do we do tons of social comparisons, but most of our social comparisons are completely unconscious and beyond the realm of our conscious control. So that's basically self-help books suggesting things that are incompatible with what social psychology tells us about human nature. Another example might be Stoicism. A lot of Stoics will tell you that life is bad. You have to learn how to live with the fact that life is bad. However, sometimes then you'll get into this idea where you think, I'm feeling bad. The Stoics tell me I shouldn't feel bad. That's not good, because that's a vicious feedback loop, because now you're going to feel bad that you're feeling bad about feeling bad. And that's not something you want to do. So you have to also take some of this advice with a grain of salt where, well, yes, life is harsh, but that doesn't mean you can't feel bad about some things. Point being is not everything said in a self-help book is compatible with what modern scientific psychology tells us about our own nature. Self-help books can also come with a lot of low-tier advice or give like a false sense of hope. This is in part because, as I said before, there is a lot of self-help books. It is a very easy genre to write that's accessible, right? And so because it's so accessible, a lot of people try and make money selling it, and they don't really care about what's going on inside the book. What you'll see sometimes is low-tier advice for things like, okay, let's say you're trying to deal with depression and you want to read books about depression. Rather than looking at meta-studies, looking at mass populations of people with depression and making scientifically informed opinions, you'll get things like you should make your bed, clean your room, diet, right? And although these things are actually good, it's not going to cure your depression. On top of the low-tier advice is you can get a thing like a false sense of hope. You'll get a false sense of hope because you'll say, read a book about 7 habits that millionaires do, you'll implement these 7 habits, and then lo and behold, you don't become a millionaire 6 months later. Like, that's shocker, right? So you can get like this false sense of hope that you're going to become a millionaire by doing these habits. If that doesn't happen, that's not good. And so you need to be careful when you're reading these self-help books for low-tier advice and people who promise too much for what they're actually offering. The last 2 cons I want to mention are, one, that a lot of self-help books, unfortunately, are written with like clickbait in mind. They're search engine optimized, and so they might actually sell a lot of books, might actually have a lot of good reviews because they're marketed well, but the actual book is bad. So watch out for that. The other thing is that a lot of self-help books will give general life advice, and that's fine. Everyone does that. That's great. But they don't realize that it's there's circumstances that change the effectiveness of that general advice. And you'll see this with books like the 48 Laws of Power, where he has laws of power or laws for life, but then you can actually find empirical studies that would negate the law, because we've already found this in like academic psychology, where like personality changes based on circumstance, or the power of a situation can have a greater effect on you than you can have on the situation. So that's also stuff to keep in mind, is when the book is always high up in the ideals and in the general principles and laws, you have to keep in mind that circumstances can actually be more powerful, completely negate laws, and almost make it so that the law is more harmful than it is helpful. That's something else. That's a con of self-help books. It's too general, not enough detailed circumstance. So those are the pros and cons of self-help books. I want to say some general things before I close this video. When I read self-help books, I tend to do it every 6 months or 5 months, somewhere around this area. and I'll just look at something that I've been consistently lacking in my life and pick a book based off of that. I see a lot of people will read self-help books every week for like a whole year. In fact, on Bookstagram, people will do this thing where they read like 100 self-help books a year, if it's 2 self-help books a year or something like this. I think that's a bit of a mistake, because in order to implement something in your life on a systematic scale, it takes time. And that's not something you can do in 1 week's time. It usually takes a couple of months. I would say at least 2 months. The last thing I want to mention here, and this is like a really important thing, because again, the self-help book market saturated with clickbait books, is how to identify good self-help books. So if you see a book that's written by a business guru, and the business guru is pushing the book really hard, just because they're a business guru doesn't actually mean they write good books, right? If they're really good at business, doesn't mean they're actually really good at writing books. You should also probably check to see if they've inherited anything, because that could have a big say on how good they are at actually doing business. It's at least a factor, right? You want to check the credentials of authors, controversies behind authors, what other people are saying about the books, because again, there's so many bad self-help books out there, and there's only a few good ones, arguably. I found that the ones published by Harvard psychologists or philosophers tend to be really good, well-cited. Not saying that people who have degrees make the best books. I'm sure there are books that are written by people without degrees that are really good, but it's just a heuristic, right? That's a way of looking at it. Be careful with buying books that have a very clickbaity title and sell you on something that you want to be true, like How to Become a Millionaire, because those are usually the bad ones. And with that being said, guys, tschüss.